Now, let me just press the slide buttons. We have a little flash of all our sponsors because they're important and they make it possible for us to all be here. And now we move on to, everyone can take a little bit of a deep breath. This is one of our fireside chats, a little bit more of a relaxed session and a little bit more of a left field one. So I want to check, Dave, are you out there and online?
I am.
Fantastic. Okay, let me introduce to the audience who we've got here and why I've put you in the program. Now, some years ago, just as I wound down my own CDN and moved into running ideas and doing the software side of CDN stuff, I went to a content delivery summit over in New York and I was sat listening to one of the sessions and I peered at the badge of the chap sat next to me and it was Dave Temkin from Netflix. And I was slightly nervous, to be honest, because I'd had quite a lot of experience with the CDN space, but not with one that had quite the scale that Dave was at the helm of. So before we go into that, Dave, tell us what you're doing. Tell us what your role is today, and so on. And we're going to go sort of then rewind in history and go forward. So, Dave, tell us about your role and what you're doing today.
Of course. So after taking about, what is it, May now? A little over 5 months off after leaving Netflix in the beginning of the year, I am now SVP of Infrastructure and Cloud Operations for Imperva.
Well, they made a good hire. I think you know something about that.
A little bit.
So, what I'd like to start with is actually a little bit of prehistory before you joined Netflix, and what led you to taking on the role and taking on the responsibility for looking after Netflix CDN? What was your journey to that point?
My journey to that point was slightly non-contiguous. I started at Netflix at the end of 2008, back when it was primarily a DVD shipping business. We had an awful lot of customers who we were shipping DVDs to, and very few streaming customers. What streaming customers we did have, the streaming service was not overly compelling. The content wasn't great. It was very early days, but there was no mistake. The company was called Netflix for a reason. The intention had always been to get to the point where they would be delivering their most of, if not all of their content online. I started there looking after the infrastructure that at that time was primarily in data centers. We had a couple of co-location facilities in the Bay Area, a bunch of huge monolithic Oracle databases, and just a very, very legacy architecture. Around the end of 2009, it was decided to do two things. First of all, move the lion's share, if not all, of the streaming infrastructure to AWS from a compute perspective, and to move the content delivery to, at that point, the three market leaders for CDN, which were at that point Akamai, Limelight, and Level 3. Obviously, very different landscape today.
So had you come from a cloud sort of virtualized infrastructure background or telecoms background, or?
I came from a kind of mixed background. My position before I got to Netflix was at Yahoo, where I was running layer 4 through 7 network architecture. I had gotten to Yahoo, though, from a startup that was acquired by Yahoo called Right Media. And that was right in my wheelhouse of building. And so we built that business and then we sold it to Yahoo. And so, I was at Netflix for almost 2 years. And when that change in consolidation happened, I decided that I was actually going to leave. So I left Netflix. And I was gone for about 9 months. I ended up going to Telex, which is now owned by Digital Realty. And, I actually was really enjoying my time there. I was working with a lot of really nice people. And, they were quite obviously for sale, and there was, potential exit involved and all that other fun stuff. But at that time, I then got a Yahoo Messenger message from my old boss, Ken, basically saying, hey, I think I've managed to change Reed's mind on whether or not we should build our own infrastructure for delivery based on a lot of things, including carrier relationships and the current state at that time of the CDN industry. If we do that, do you want to build the network? And I was like, yes. And that was kind of the end of that. And I gave my notice at Telex, and I walked in. He's no longer with us, but I walked into Eric Shapcaro's office and said, "Eric, I've got some bad news." And he said, "Okay, well, when's your first day back at Netflix?" And I was like, "How did you know that?" He's like, "I just had a feeling." I was like, "Okay." So yeah, and the rest is history.
Or were you just purely excited? Do you know you could do it, or was it a slightly? I suppose at the time it wasn't actively shipping the quantity of data it's shipping today, but
yeah, I mean, the scale, I guess the scale was commensurate with the time to some extent, but it was definitely pushing limits. If you look back at the history of, Netflix versus Comcast or the other ISPs, at that time, obviously it was a compelling amount of traffic that was in some ways problematic for some of the CDNs to be able to deliver. So it was maybe slightly intimidating, but also incredibly exciting. And so in my case, I'm the kind of person who likes to build things. That was just as exciting as it could probably get at that point.
awesome. Okay, so day one, what was the infrastructure like? What were you faced with?
So I walked in and started with, I think there were 3 other people on the team aside from my boss, Ken, who I worked for almost the entire 12 years that I was there. There was someone who was my peer, David Fulliger, who was working on the actual architecture of the overall system. And then we had a couple of people thinking about operations. We set out to get this thing up and running as quickly as possible, at least to get a proof of concept going and get delivery going as rapidly as we could. And I want to say from the time that I walked in the door to the time that we started serving the first bytes from our CDN was roughly 3 months. There was obviously a lot of optimization that happened after that, but we had, I should have, in hindsight, shown a picture of our first POP in San Jose, but we had something stood up quite quickly and then started looking at, okay, how do we scale this from here?
And what was the MVP on day one? Did you scope things to just certain codecs, certain platforms? Did you have certain?
It was more scoped to ISPs actually, which was where are we having the most delivery issues? How can we try to resolve those? And so we didn't necessarily scope specific devices. If I remember correctly, this is going back 10 plus years now. If I remember correctly, we did slow roll there were some devices that we had issues getting to talk to our CDN versus the software that had been embedded in them to basically only be able to talk to the third-party CDNs. And some of them were like, for example, really old Blu-ray players that had a Netflix client built in. And some of those we just couldn't fix. And so some of those we just had to wait out until we could, either people stopped using them or they were end of life.
What I'm trying to think, 2009, right? 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So tail end of Flash, was Flash still around, or were you straight into
we were never Flash for delivery. At that point, in the very early days, we were Microsoft Silverlight, which was a Flash competitor, which was arguably more secure than Flash, and it also featured some DRM functionality that at that point, when almost all of Netflix's content was being delivered or was being provided by third-party studios, we had a lot of restrictions on what types of DRM we could use. And in some cases, different studios mandated different types of DRM for different device types. And so we actually had to support multiple types of DRM in order to make that happen. And that over time, A, as more services came online and that started to get standardized, and B, as we started making our own content, we were able to get away from a world in which we had all these different types of DRM.
And did you have a vision? Did you sort of running ahead of where you started on day one? Did you guys have sort of what was on the whiteboard at that time? What was the aspiration and what were the, I sort of want to ask as a secondary question, what were the course corrections that you took? But what was the whiteboard sort of?
Sure. There were a few things that we were really thinking about in the early days. One, coming back to the delivery issues that we were facing, one was getting delivery stabilized and improved to our end users. We had real metrics that showed that the delivery issues that we were facing were causing customer service issues for sure. If you think about Netflix today, the user experience is nothing like it was 10 years ago, or even 7 or 8 years ago. But users really hate rebuffers, for example. They'll take crappy video quality over a rebuffer any day when you just start talking about scoring their experience. And so trying to balance all of that, how do we get traffic through these, at that point, congested pipes to get to the most amount of customers as possible at the best quality as possible? And so we really set out in the beginning to stabilize before we optimized. And then, we thought, to your point, of how can we now optimize the system to scale it? At that time, we were just operating in North and South America. We had just launched South America, but we had aspirations to go to Europe. We had aspirations to go to Asia, and then eventually, we ended up in launching a global service.
Was there a breakthrough moment where you did, I was just looking for a couple of sort of case stories or something. Was there a breakthrough moment where you thought, actually, if we press this button over here and route that over there, and it made a massive difference? Are there a couple of good instances of decisions you made at that stage that made a really big difference?
Yeah, we really looked at how can we get our content as close to end users as possible. And the thing that we really thought about back then was, because these are, big fat streams of data, the latency didn't really matter that much. And so as we're building the system, we really weren't necessarily paying attention to latency, but what we were paying attention to was the cost of getting that data down to the end user. And so what we really, set out to do was to put ourselves in a position where we could embed as much of that traffic, we could get it served from within end users' networks, and use our network kind of as the backstop to that. And by going with that embed first strategy, that really kind of set us apart, both from going to ISPs and being able to say to them, hey, we're going to give you this hardware for free. We know that there are these other business issues at play. Let's just set those aside for right now. But we're going to give you this hardware for free. You put it in your network. We're going to make sure that you're not paying, whether, if it's a tier 1, they don't really care about transit, but they do care about the cost of transport. So, you're going to reduce your transport costs. And if they're a tier 2, we're going to reduce your transit costs. And really our focus was, how do we get that as close to the end user as possible with high quality as possible, while keeping both the network's costs down as well as our own costs. We were spending millions and tens of millions of dollars on this hardware that we were effectively giving away for free.
And that was moving the cost center of the transit and peering out into the access networks in principle, from your points of origination.
Yeah, it really, at the end of the day, that was always a fun argument, which was, we would say to people, well, we're going to give you this equipment for free, and you should embed it in your networks. And they go, well, why would we give you access to our network for free? You would otherwise be paying for transit or peering, and now you're not paying for anything. You're like, well, here's this team of 100+ people whose headcount we're paying for, and here's tens of millions of dollars of hardware that we're refreshing, really hundreds of millions of dollars of hardware that we're refreshing every X period of time, that we are literally signing title over to you. If you want to wipe it and put Windows XP on it, go ahead. Good luck, but it's your hardware to do as you please.
Right. Yeah, I remember the debates with my own CDN, possibly 5 or 6 years before that, but the debates on we're always sort of stymied with, well, they're your customers at the end of the day. They're our joint customers, but they're your customers who want the content. And of course, we could turn it off. So, a guerrilla way to do that as an organization. So, was there a particular development that excited you personally as that journey went forward? Was there something that really sort of got you going?
The whole thing was a blast, if I'm being honest. We had plenty of stressful moments, plenty of oh crap moments, plenty of times where things didn't quite work out the way that we hoped they would or expected they would. But by and large, being able to be at the forefront of transforming not only Netflix as a business, but also content delivery as a business, was just really fantastic. And there were plenty of missteps along the way, because we really were forging a bunch of new ground. And granted, there were people who came before us that thought about this differently. You know, Akamai, obviously for years, had an embedded caching program. You know, Google did to some extent as well with GCP, but we really were seeking to kind of turn that on its head and provide, you know, a guarantee, if you will, basically be able to tell networks, yeah, if you put this in your network, you will offload 90+% of your traffic, and we're going to guarantee you that that's how it's going to work. And so, you know, making those kinds of promises really kind of drove us to try to make this system as efficient as possible. You know, I really enjoyed getting to know the various ISPs around the world. It was one of the most interesting things to me, at least, and I'm sure to others. You know, it's easy to lump ISPs together. It's easy to start thinking about, you know, well, AT&T is probably very similar to NTT. They both operate a broadband network that's primarily DSL and fiber based, and yada yada yada. You learn and you speak with the engineers and the leadership in these networks, and you find that no, they operate quite differently. I mean, obviously that's a pretty extreme example just from a cultural perspective, but from how they build their networks is also quite different, how they think about the architecture of them. And so getting to travel and have these discussions and help people figure out how to get the Netflix product to work really well on their networks, and generally, you know, got plenty of thank yous from people who were spending a lot of money on things like transport, that we, you know, in some cases, there were networks that had hundreds of gigs of transport that basically overnight we were, you know, able to take down to next to nothing. And those were always fun conversations.
And did you, as you hit certain territories, I'm thinking, you know, sort of entering LATAM or entering emerging economy territories and so on, were there decisions you had to make, sort of limiting, you know, bit rates, higher bit rates, or limiting, you know, what were the sort of technical nuances as you went around the world and targeted different regions?
I think it's interesting if you go back and look at, for example, the Netflix ISP speed index from when we launched it, you know, whatever that was, 7 or 8 years ago, 9 years ago, to today, you'll see that things have very much so converged around the world, where when it first was launched, you know, Brazil did not look very good. But now you look at Brazil and it looks fantastic. And you know, one of the things that we did was we really worked to push networks to improve their delivery. And that speed index was very helpful, and providing the infrastructure we did was very helpful. And you know, to that end, that was definitely a thing where, you know, we looked at a market like Brazil and said, okay, it's underperforming now. How do we get this to a place where it is great? And how can we work with the ISPs to do that? And, you know, what changes do we need to make in the short term so that we're not just completely burying their networks, but how do we keep these networks trained on a long-term vision of, sorry about that. How do we get these networks trained into a long-term vision of wanting to improve themselves to get to the point where they can serve this traffic well?
And sort of as a broad question, you know, you built a fantastic CDN. It was for your business, but did it ever, you know, I know Netflix is not about live, for example, but you know, you're probably, apart from maybe, well, I don't want to sort of name other players, but there's only a few other players who've really got such a deep distribution capability. Did it ever occur that to actually perhaps offer your services to a live or a linear provider, as a, you know, actually start opening that CDN capability outside of your own content delivery?
It's interesting. When we first started the project, there was actually kind of talk that, well, maybe we will just be a separate company. We'll be Streaming Services Inc. And our biggest and our first customer will be Netflix. And then maybe we'll offer this as a service to others. We ultimately didn't do that. You know, that was something we thought about, but it's quite different to build a CDN that has to be able to serve customers versus just a single purpose. And the way that we were able to get so efficient was the fact that we were designing this CDN to just be able to serve video files at that point. Granted, it serves small objects now, amongst other things, but at that point, being able to just have that singular focus really allowed us to build it and iterate quickly. I used to joke, actually, and it's kind of ironic that I'm at a security company now where one of their products is DDoS protection, but I used to joke and basically say, hey, we have all of this outbound capacity to networks with almost no inbound being used. And anyone here who has built a network knows that you generally build networks symmetrically. And so we had all this stranded inbound. And I was like, we should just offer syncing DDoS as a service. And obviously we never did that. But that was probably the only option we really thought about at that point was something like that.
And you obviously were close users of Amazon for a long time, and I presume that relationship still. I actually lost the track with how much you still are tied in with Amazon, so on. But how has that evolved as other certainly infrastructure as a service providers have emerged? How has Netflix sort of embraced or shied away from or differentiated from that sort of proposition?
It's interesting. For many years, that was this big source of confusion with a lot of people. They'd be like, wait, so what do you do? Because I read all these articles about Netflix being in AWS. Doesn't AWS do this for you? And we'd have to explain, no, we built this CDN to specifically serve our purposes. We wanted to have the direct relationships with networks. Really, when you think about how AWS is used, the term undifferentiated heavy lifting. So things that we were not necessarily better at, which included things at that time like compute, made a lot of sense because it allowed us to focus on the things that we could be differentially better at, like content delivery, because of the scale that we were developing at that point. Over time, though, we started looking at various services and saying, hey, are there things we could do on our edge that may improve the general user experience of our users worldwide? And so there were services launched. We started small, which is like, okay, well, let's get small objects in here, because at that time they were still in Optimi. Let's start doing our own DNS, because at that time it was in Dyn. And let all these things start chipping away at the various services that were part and parcel to getting a stream started. And so nowadays, for example, if you go to Netflix from your phone or from your device, that actually, for the UX and the UI, the pieces that you see before you press play, that actually starts and finishes really on Netflix infrastructure. You're not connecting directly to AWS. You're connecting to Netflix infrastructure, which is then connecting to Amazon infrastructure. And we did that because we realized that we had better interconnectivity with most networks around the world than Amazon did. And that allowed us to put ourselves in a position where we could improve the user experience by doing simple app acceleration type stuff at the edge.
And we heard in the last panel that there was some discussion about operators sort of now shying away from building CDN and buying in from third parties. If you had sort of, with a decade of experience having done what you've done, if you had some advice for people trying to make that decision, what do you think are the tipping points? What are the sort of good points to make the decision to own and build your own, or to buy out? Have you got any sage advice?
Sure, and I will try to not make anyone upset with that advice.
Yeah, I understand.
It's certainly a sensitive topic. As I look at my screen and I see Akamai and other brands here, the thing that I think about there is coming back to what I said before about undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Are you going to put yourself in a position where you can do it better than others can, either from a cost or performance basis? And generally, if it's from a cost basis, you're able to whatever that may be, play CDNs off of each other to get better pricing or whatever that might be. But if you don't have the scale to otherwise build, and you think that when you get to that scale, you'll be in a good place, you're probably starting off on the wrong foot. If you know that you will get to that scale and that you can make that efficient, that's a totally kind of different set of circumstances. The thing about carrier CDN, for example, like you were just talking about, telco CDN, is one of the biggest challenges, for example, we face at Netflix is there are thousands of device SKUs. It's not just Chrome, IE, and Safari that you have to support. you have literally thousands and thousands of devices, and all of them have to, conform to the Netflix standard for the protocol to talk to stuff. And it's nearly impossible to QA that many devices against however many different telco CDNs get spun up around the world.
Right.
And so you're just put in a position where it's not practical. I do think there's no reason why telcos couldn't be in the CDN business and selling that as a product, not only to themselves, but for access to other networks. But from a network by network perspective, it's something that is a really, really tough value proposition to make.
So we've got 3 minutes left, and I want to ask just a short question, which is, is there, did you expect the scale that you'd reach? Did you expect it to expand that much?
I remember, I still have them upstairs. I think they were 10 million Netflix customer champagne glasses from a party that we had in the courtyard between the two buildings that the entire company fit into at that point. And I remember what a party that was and how just crazy it seemed. Wow, 10 million customers, wow. And then I remember hitting 25 million and how crazy that seemed. And then I remember, I remember the 50 million party, and then I remember the 100 million party. And when we started talking about 100 million, I started kind of disconnecting from the real scale that really was. Like in my mind, it started being like, oh, we'll just add another 25 million customers, no big deal. And I really think back to when we were counting from 1 to 5 to 10 million customers, how big of a leap each of those looked like. And then, you would start to see, quarters or just months that were growing faster than we would grow in an entire year 10 years ago.
I have to say, an old school friend of mine works for you guys, or works for Netflix as a senior partner engineer. And I looked over his shoulder once. He showed me a real-time map, and there was sort of the dawn line going, and this great sort of hot spots appearing along the dawn line. Thinking, God, that's so much traffic. He then told me that was just people signing up.
Yeah.
And I was just daunted by that. So finally, what do you think of the future of CDN? And we're going to talk a lot later on about CDN becoming a cloud and edge compute space and so on. Have you got any sort of final thoughts about what the future of CDN is for the audience?
I think the market is just as big and ripe for both opportunity and innovation as ever. You've seen new players enter in the last few years, like Fastly and others. You've seen old players who are innovating in this space. I think you will continue to see a push towards the edge. I think Netflix was very early with that. We weren't calling it edge compute at that point, but I do think that there is a lot of space for better user experience and better economics by getting CDNs as close to the edge as, however you might define the edge as possible.
Listen, Dave, that was a fast-moving half an hour, and I wish there was a bar to retire to go and talk much more about it. And I'm sure at some point we will meet at a conference, and I'll grill you even further with lots of obtuse questions. But I did promise you it wouldn't be a This Is Your Life, but it was something of a This Is Your Life. So really appreciate you sparing the time to join us today, and I look forward to speaking to you more in due course.
Of course, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Speak to you soon.